Hi, students. This video is sort of a review of some of the basics of Buddhism that you've been learning about from reading Noah Rashida's book, No Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners. We're going to review sort of the basic tenets of Buddhism that he touches on in that book, and then we're going to relate what we've learned sort of about the tenets of Buddhism to Buddhist art. And then this week, you're going to be doing a little project exploring figures of the Buddha. And you'll need some of the information in this presentation to be able to do that assignment. Okay, so let's review a little bit what we've learned about the life of the historical Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha, who Rashida tells us about. As you may remember, he was born a prince. He had a life of luxury. Um, he's quoted as saying, "I was delicately nurtured. At my father's residence, lotus ponds were made just for my enjoyment. In one of them, blue lotuses bloomed, in another, red lotuses, and in a third, white lotuses. By day and by night, a white canopy was held over me so that cold and heat, dust, grass, and dew would not settle on me. I had three mansions, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rainy season. I spent the 4 months of the rains in the rainy season mansion being entertained by musicians, none of whom were male, and I did not leave the mansion." So an incredible life of luxury was where he was born and was where he sort of came of age. However, things change for the Buddha when he's 22. When he is out traveling, I think in a carriage, it's described as, and he sees what are now referred to as the four sights. He sees an old man, so he recognizes that he himself is going to get older. He sees somebody who's ill. He sees somebody who's dead. And he sees a holy man, sometimes translated as an ascetic. And this is sort of the catalyst for his life changing, because he's been so protected from suffering that he is shocked by it when he sees it. He doesn't just see suffering, but he sees impermanence, that our bodies are going to change and get old, that we're going to eventually die, that we can get sick, that we're vulnerable. And then he also sees this holy man. So he's aware of sort of a spiritual life. After that, finding the answer to the problem of suffering became the most important thing in Siddhartha's life. But he knew that if he stayed in the palace, he would find no answers. It is said that on the night his own son Rahula was born, he left the palace for good in search of an answer. He got up quietly, kissed his wife and newborn son, woke Chana, who was his assistant, and they crept past the sleeping guards and silently rode away from the palace. When they both reached the edge of a river, they dismounted from their horses. Taking his sword, Siddhartha cut off his hair and swapped his rich clothes for the clothes of a beggar. He gave all his rings and bracelets to Chana to take back to his father. Chana watched as Siddhartha crossed the river and disappeared into the forest on the other side. By giving up his possessions and the symbols of his previous life, Siddhartha was letting go of the things that he thought were keeping him ignorant and thus resulting in his suffering. Later, he was to teach that renunciation, a letting go, was important in reaching enlightenment. So when the Buddha first tried to reach enlightenment, his approach was asceticism. And asceticism is a practice in which people fast, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't have sex. They deny all the kind of things our bodies crave. And these are images of ascetics. You can see their ribs sticking out because they're so starving because they don't eat. And that was his first approach. So at first he practiced fasting and asceticism, and he was frustrated. He wasn't reaching enlightenment. And this this moment in the Buddha searching for his enlightenment is not really dealt with in Rashida. It's left out. But I think in a lot of other accounts of the Buddha reaching enlightenment, this moment is super important. And I'm going to include it here because I think it does relate or connect to some of the things that Rashida says are sort of foundational to Buddhism. After not reaching enlightenment, he was visited by a local lady who brought him rice. This is translated different ways in different accounts. Sometimes she's referred to as a milkmaid who brings him milk. Other times it's a local lady who brings him rice. And even though he's been fasting, he's frustrated. So he takes the rice or he sips the milk. And afterwards, he reaches enlightenment. And so one of the reasons I think this is a really key part of the story that we don't want to leave out is because it is that moment he understands his interconnectedness to the world. So before that, he believed he had to deny his body everything it wanted. But at this moment, he says, oh, no, I'm in a human body, and a human body needs food. I'm connected to the world. I need things from the world. I'm dependent on the world. And so it is only when he embraces the things he needs that his body needs that he is able to reach enlightenment. So this was a new view of how to reach enlightenment. Asceticism is not the answer for the Buddha, and in Buddhism, Buddhists believe we must embrace our physical bodies and its needs as part of our existence because we are not gods, we're humans. So out of the Buddha's own experience of reaching enlightenment, he developed some teachings. And these teachings are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which Rashida talks about in No Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners. Rashida translates the Four Noble Truths somewhat differently. They're translated differently in different contexts. So you may prefer his translations or you may prefer the ones I have here. Either way, I think you'll get their basic idea. So the Four Noble Truths are life is suffering. That's the first one. Suffering is due to some kind of attachment. I think Rashida translates life is suffering as like something like suffering is part of our lives. It's a permanent part of our lives. It's never going to end. It's never going to go away entirely. It's always going to arise. Suffering is due to attachment is the second Four Noble Truth. The second of the Four Noble Truths. The third Noble Truth is that attachment can be overcome. And the fourth is that there is a path for accomplishing this, for overcoming our suffering. And that path is the Eightfold Path. And again, Rashida translates particularly, mostly just, I think, the first two steps in the Eightfold Path differently. He calls right view, right understanding, and he calls right aspiration, right intent. The others, I think, are translated the same way. Those two are referred to as prajna, or wisdom. The other steps on the path are right speech, right action, right livelihood. These three are referred to as shila, or morality. The sixth is right effort. The seventh is right mindfulness. The eighth is right concentration. And the last three are known as samadhi, or meditation. Rashida gives a pretty good discussion of each of these in his book, so I won't linger on them. The important thing to know is that Buddhist practice involves each of these steps. And the Buddhist teachings are that to reach enlightenment, you have to follow these steps. Okay, so we're going to talk next about Buddhist art, and we're going to connect Buddhist art to we've already been learning about Buddhism, and then I'm going to ask you to do some thinking and exploring of Buddhist art to sort of see how Buddhist philosophy permeates Buddhist art. Buddhism evolves and is interpreted differently by different people in different places. It started in India, but in different countries, it has different foci among different sects of Buddhism. So you can see here there are both of these images are of Buddhas, but you can see the Buddhas are very different. One is very fat and gold, and the other is not so fat and in a very not smiling, a very stoic kind of posture in the other. And that's a good example of how Buddhism is different in different places. Buddhism is flexible. As Buddhism comes into different cultures, including our own, including the United States, it changes. You can read about the Buddha of Oakland, who's a man who erected a Buddha in Oakland, California. The great appeal of Buddhism is its teaching of wisdom, compassion, and humility. Often the way of Buddhism is considered the middle path. Its emphasis on moral and ethical perfection, a democratic outlook, and a casteless society has widened its attraction. You can imagine why Buddhism may have become very popular in the United States, because we like to believe we have a casteless society and a democratic outlook. So it fits very nicely with a lot of American values. If we can define American values, we're such a diverse country. It's hard sometimes to do that. Buddha just means the awakened one. Buddha is a being that has achieved enlightenment, the ability to understand the true nature of all things, and has been released from samsara, which is the cycle of suffering. The Bodhi tree, the Buddha was sitting underneath the Bodhi tree when he came to enlightenment. Because of its flexibility, Buddhism spread widely. It spread widely in part because it was not location specific. Believers did not need to worship at a particular temple or at a particular site as part of their practice. Worship could take place anywhere and at any time. This freedom resulted in the emergence of Buddhist art throughout Asia and eventually through much of the world. So these are some of the places where Buddhism spread. The earliest Buddhist art we know is aniconic, which is a great cocktail party word. You can throw that word around and everybody will know you're very educated. Aniconic art is just art that does not represent the icon of the Buddha. So the historical Buddha lived between around 563 BC to 483 BC and was not depicted in human form for some 400 years after his death. He was represented instead by various symbols like a wheel, a shrine, a tree, and footprints adorned with the marks of his divine nature. These footprints became a popular symbol across the Buddhist world for his earthly existence and continued to be made and revered after images of him became widespread. But eventually, images of the Buddha did exist, did come into being. And you'll notice in these images we're seeing here that there were different gestures and different images of the Buddha. In this gesture on the left, there was an earth-touching gesture. That's an image from the 10th century. The image on the right is turning the wheel of the law. It's an image of Buddha giving his first sermon. So different gestures with different Buddhas. Here's another gesture, him raising his hand. Here he's got his hands close to his chest. To fully appreciate the variety of these different Buddhas, it's important to learn more about some key characteristics of them. The Buddha is often depicted sitting on a lotus flower. The lotus flower, you can read about its importance, but a really helpful thing, and you can see lotuses here in LA. There are lotuses at the Huntington Museum in Pasadena, really beautiful. But the sort of significance of the lotus in Buddhist art is that a lotus grows in mud. It grows in muck. And that is sort of a metaphor in Buddhist art for the way we can cultivate our practice in sort of the muck of suffering or the muck of daily life. That the muddiness of our lives can actually nourish our practice and strengthen us and spur our growth. So the Buddha is often depicted sitting in a lotus flower. So you can see that in this image. You can see the sort of heart-shaped petals of the lotus underneath the Buddha. Sacred hand gestures called mudras are very important in understanding different images of the Buddha. And to learn what different mudras mean, you've got a link here you can go to, and that link will be repeated at different points in this presentation and also on the assignment page for the Buddhist art discussion we're going to have this week. So each of those mudras means something very specific. The pose a Buddha is in these images is also very significant, and each pose has a different meaning, and you're also going to explore those this week. To see how different images of the Buddha can emphasize different aspects of Buddhism, check out this video of art historians discussing, I'm going to turn that off right now, some different Buddhas in the collection of the American Museum of Natural History. And there'll be a link to that on our discussion page as well. Really want to move on. Can I? Yes. Now let's discuss how these images of the Buddha relate to this unit on Buddhism. Here's what you're going to do this week. You're going to find an image of the Buddha that you like, either by looking on the internet or in a book or in a museum collection. I'll give you some links to some collections. Identify its location and who made it, when, if possible. Describe its pose, the mudra the Buddha's hands are in, and whether or not your Buddha is sitting on a lotus flower, and explain what these aspects of your Buddha might suggest about its purpose or meaning. Draw a connection between the Buddha you selected and a sentence or passage from No Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners, not the title that's printed there. I need to correct that. You can find more details on the requirements for this week's discussion, including due dates, in this week's module. And then I give you some links to review this, and all these links are repeated in this week's module. There's a link to review the significance of the lotus flower in Buddhist art, a link to review the significance of the different mudras in the images of the Buddha, and a link to review the significance of the different poses in images of the Buddha. So that's what you're going to do. You're going to take these links, you're going to learn about what all these different poses and mudras mean, and then you're going to share them with us, and then you're going to reply to your classmates' posts as well. I'm going to see if there's anything else from this. That's the end of the slideshow. Um, Let me know if you have any questions or concerns about all this, and I'm going to stop recording.